So what I'm going to share right now is going to be my dissertation defense. I did pass it, but I do want to put it out there in the open and have some of this information available to anybody that wants to do research on this topic in the future. Some of my future plans would be to share some of the chapters from my dissertation and then go more in depth with some of those chapters that I made available in my dissertation. So if you take a look at the show notes, you'll see a link for my dissertation as well. So let's go ahead and move on to the first slide of my defense. So the problem addressed in the study is the lack of opportunities for students to cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking through traditional art education in the PK-12 curriculum. So due to high-stakes testing, the United States has nearly eliminated art education to focus on test preparation. The purpose of the study was to use an autoethnography and examine my own teaching experiences and strategies in cultivating student self-efficacy and divergent thinking at one middle school in the Inland Empire located in Southern California. So self-efficacy is a student's ability to cultivate confidence and competence in their ability to achieve the desired outcomes even when mistakes and failure occur. Self-efficacy is essential when students are learning academic content for the first time, and students might not initially grasp the content and other school disciplines. Creative self-efficacy is a student's belief that they can produce creative outcomes. When students are learning the same content through general education, students need opportunities for divergent thinking to think and learn differently from one another. So my first research question in my study was, what teaching experiences and observations do I as an art teacher have in cultivating students' self-efficacy when incorporating art education with creative learning principles? And the second research question that I addressed was, what teaching experiences and observations do I as an art teacher have in cultivating students' divergent thinking when incorporating art education with creative learning principles? So this is going to be the theoretical framework that I used, which was critical race theory. So critical race theory is a framework central to identifying and centralizing issues of race and racism as they intersect with other forms of marginalization in U.S. society. So there's 5 tenets to critical race theory. The first tenet is subordination is central and intersects with the race and racism. The second is it challenges dominant education ideology. The third is there's a commitment to social justice. And the fourth tenet, there's a value for experiential knowledge. And the fifth tenet would be there's also a value in interdisciplinary knowledge. So critical race theory would allow students to use lived experiences, cultural competence, and interdisciplinary knowledge as part of their art education that includes creative learning principles. Although Ellis does not mention critical race theory in her study, Ellis does make connections of how learning through creative learning principles embraces students' knowledge gained from personal and academic lives to develop solutions through rhizomatic learning. Rhizomatic learning makes connections between concepts learned from inside and outside of school and can be applied to a problem from any subject matter to create a creative solution. Critical pedagogy is the second framework that occurs when students become critically conscious of their circumstances in the school setting. Through critical consciousness, students can examine social inequities critically that occur in their community. So this is some of the supporting literature that I used in my study, which would be in my chapter 2. So in the United States, art education is not a course that is required for students to take in elementary or middle school. Dating back to the Nixon presidential administration, scores from the standardized tests were used to determine the amount of funding that schools would receive. Low test scores shifted funding from art programs to pay for test preparation and remedial courses since it was perceived that students were getting behind academically due to traditional art classes. Traditional art education in the United States focuses on the fundamentals of art, the effective benefits, aesthetic, expression, tools, techniques, assisting with improving students' scores on assessments and academic achievement. Traditional art education utilizes lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy and lower levels of Webb's DOK. So Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's DOK are different levels of learning that a student performs based on the difficulty of an assignment. Lower levels of learning only require short-term recall and memorizing. Art education that includes creative learning principles utilize higher levels of learning. So CLP incorporates project-based learning that is interdisciplinary. CLP encourages students to develop original ideas and solutions that are different from other students while having students continue to assess their work and improving on it. Although not explicitly stated in a study conducted by Alice, art education that implemented CLP cultivated self-efficacy and divergent thinking. As a result of the Alice study, CLP encouraged students to score higher on the grading rubric that coincided with the level of Bloom's and Webb's DOK and attain higher levels of thinking. Students were graded higher on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's DOK that students used. Students were motivated to put more effort into projects and make connections of what they were doing in class to how much effort they were exerting to complete higher levels of thinking. The implications of introducing art education that includes CLP for middle school students is that students will have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, and as a result, students will have the opportunity to learn without the consequences of high-stakes testing. So the word gaps in the literature that I was using, there is a need for research from the teacher's perspective to observe students' self-efficacy and divergent thinking, since students may struggle with perceiving their self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Research from a teacher's perspective, observation, and experience are valuable because students may not be aware of their growth, their strengths, and what their assets are. There needs to be more research on the value of art education for higher levels of learning in Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's DOK, which proposes a question. So what effects do the practices, routines, and procedures in an art education that incorporates creative learning principles have on the student's self-efficacy and divergent thinking? Can art education that uses higher levels of thinking have an effect on the student's self-efficacy and divergent thinking? And this is the research design that I used for my research. The methodology implemented was an autoethnography comprised of using my personal experiences and observations as a teacher to formulate a perspective from an educator that incorporates creative learning principles with art education. So Alice described autoethnography as an overlap between art and science. It is part art or self and part ethos or culture. Qualitative data was collected from different observations of students' self-efficacy and divergent thinking. The personal experiences of the autoethnography gave me as a researcher the opportunity to elaborate through the perspective of an art educator. Although autoethnographies do receive criticism and are perceived as self-indulgent and narcissistic, but the researcher should be viewed as a resource and beneficial for the first-hand insight provided in an autoethnography. Even traditional criteria used to evaluate methodologies do not consider practice as part of their research. Instead, traditional criteria focus solely on the research. The research setting was at a lower socioeconomic public middle school in the Inland Empire located in Southern California. Based on the same data, 84% of the students in the district are eligible to receive free and reduced school meals. Over 87% of the students identify as Hispanic Latino. A large portion of the students are English learners, with almost 33% of the population. The sample that I used for this research, I served as both the researcher and the art teacher used for this autoethnographic study. The students that I observed were 5 middle school students that chose to be enrolled in the art class and 5 middle school students that were placed in the art class by their school counselors. And then the data that I used for this research, I created an outline of the students' projects during the study's timeline. As part of the outline, I reflected on instances of self-efficacy and divergent thinking for each project, level of DOK, and Bloom's taxonomy that the students cultivated in art education with creative learning principles. Throughout this autoethnography, I gave personal experiences of observations that respond to the research question. These experiences focused on myself as the art teacher and how the class is designed to cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Data collection for the autoethnographic study comprised of rich, thick descriptions from my observations of student self-efficacy and divergent thinking. I coded field notes, memos, observations, and personal experiences to determine patterns and themes. I reflected on observations that are dated in journals, field notes, and memos to recall experiences. I used coding to examine if my experiences as the teacher have changed through the duration of the study by comparing observations of students throughout the study. As the researcher, I implemented deductive and inductive coding to ensure that patterns are documented. I used semiotic analysis to identify how and why students use specific visual signs and linguistic signs. And I used tracking the students' use of semiotic analysis with memos assisted in determining how students have cultivated characteristics of self-efficacy through the use of terminology used in art. I analyzed field notes to assist in identifying patterns of self-efficacy and divergent thinking during the observations. While observing students, patterns were determined based on my interactions with the students. These field notes will allow readers to have insight into how our education has impacted student self-efficacy and divergent thinking through the teacher's perspective. I documented the number of observations of student self-efficacy and divergent thinking based on a grading rubric developed by Ellis. I identified the student self-efficacy and divergent thinking level by placing the assignment that they had completed according to the different levels of Webb's DOK and Bloom's taxonomy. So collectively, Webb's DOK and Bloom's taxonomy are what the creative learning principles consist of. I evaluated the students' work based on those creative learning principles. After the students completed their assignments, I assessed their divergent thinking based on the grading rubric. And this is the grading rubric that I used over here. So this is the way that students will get graded, and these coincide with higher levels of DOK. So in these higher levels, students actually creating something, they're reassessing an assignment, they're reflecting on a project. Whereas over here in the lower levels of DOK and Bloom's taxonomy, some students might not complete a project all the way, they might just replicate something. So if a student scores higher over here, that would be an example of higher self-efficacy and divergent thinking. And if a student scores over here in this column, that means that's a lower level of self-efficacy and divergent thinking. For validity and trustworthiness, the study was approved through a rigorous review by the Institutional Review Board. The study was also approved through a review by the school district where the study and this research was conducted. The strategies that would be used to enhance trustworthiness include crystallization, thick descriptions, prolonged engagement, member checking, peer review, an audit trail, and the clarification of the researcher's biases. As the researcher, I provided my subjectivity statement to be transparent with any biases that I may hold as the instructor that conducted the study. I used triangulation to collect data from multiple sources to objectively understand and interpret the study's findings. Positionality. I have included a subjectivity statement for the sake of transparency and to enhance the trustworthiness of the study. I am both the art teacher and researcher for the class that the students were enrolled in for the study. Building rapport with the students was part of the qualitative research process that I implemented. And I grew up and continue to live in a similar socioeconomic background as the students that were observed. The diversity of the students in the school for the study is similar to the school that I attended when I was in middle school. As a key finding in the study, the strategies that cultivated self-efficacy and divergent thinking were differentiated and interdisciplinary learning in art education that used creative learning principles. Students became more critically conscious of their education when creative learning principles were incorporated. Using critical race theory as the framework allowed students to use lived experiences, cultural competence, and interdisciplinary knowledge from the projects that they completed. Students gain knowledge through rhizomatic learning from the students' personal and academic lives to cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking. As students were able to incorporate their interests and lives into the projects, they were more invested in the projects they created, allowing them to cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Thought-provoking dialogue that occurs when students are critically conscious occurred in the class that uses creative learning principles that encourages students to ask questions. For higher levels of cognitive learning to occur, Ferry believed that dialogue must be reciprocal between students and teachers. The dialogue that Ferry mentioned occurred in this art education class that uses creative learning principles as students received feedback from me as the teacher. The transformation of knowledge occurred as students became critically conscious when they planned, designed, created, reflected, and continued to improve their artwork. I hope that as a result of this study, students will be able to use the same self-efficacy and divergent thinking learned in art and transfer that self-efficacy and divergent thinking to other disciplines to be successful academically and in their future careers. As a finding of the study, an autoethnography was the ideal method to implement this study to cultivate student self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Autoethnographies are another form of discovery for internal decision-making as a teacher. Teachers' decisions need to be considered valid and noteworthy because of what teachers can learn about their student self-efficacy and divergent thinking from reflecting. An autoethnography allowed me to improve and enhance my teaching by reflecting on observations and experiences. Without having dialogue with the students, I, as a teacher, would not have been successful at cultivating student self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Recommendations for future educational leaders would be to create opportunities to cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking by introducing art education with creative learning principles at earlier grade levels. So reform in education also needs to occur with educational leaders' perceptions of art education. Teachers' perspective as first-hand insight throughout ethnography should be valued as research and as data. Teachers should also be valued as agents of change when they implement an innovative curriculum that breaks away from the script of the traditional curriculum. So again, this was just the same slides that I used for my dissertation defense. Unfortunately, there was no artwork of what the students actually created because it had to go through an IRB, and the student artwork was not considered as a part of the IRB. So again, thank you. This video was just to share with you the slides from my dissertation. In future videos, I plan on releasing some of the other information from my dissertation that I didn't cover or didn't go in depth enough in this video. So it'll go more into depth as far as multiple intelligences and the benefits of multiple intelligences. My literature review will go into the history of high-stakes testing, the history of art education, and how it was actually a big part of our education before. It's going to go more into depth as far as Webb's DLK, Bloom's taxonomy. In chapter 3, that's going to go more into my research design and methodology. So it's going more into depth as far as the results in my chapter 4. And then in chapter 5, that'll go into recommendations and conclusions. So these future videos would also address any criticisms that our education receives and why there is this perception of art. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Keep an eye out for future videos that go into these other chapters as well.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And feel free to watch any of the other related videos.